Hi there, Psych fans. Today we're going to talk in my brain. I have my brain shirt on for you. But I want to cover just a couple of topics that I think are kind of hard to explain through just a PowerPoint, but a little bit of a lecture. Just some basic stuff about the nervous system and how it actually, in terms of how it forms and how it starts to connect. And one of the keywords, our word for today, is plasticity. And so I want to explain a little bit what that means. All right, when we're talking about our brains develop in utero, all right, in terms of, after conception, brains develop from the bottom up, okay? And there's three main levels. We talk about the lower level is the brainstem, and then a midbrain area, and then the upper level, which is our cerebral cortex. That's the part that you think of when you think of this gray, ridgy stuff. All right, when a baby is born, all right, I like to think of this analogy when we're talking about the word plasticity. Plasticity refers to that ability of that brain to wire itself, right? The brain is just not a bunch of parts. It also has to basically program itself. I think of it like this. It's like buying a new computer. Let's say you're going to buy an actual desktop, if people still do that, all right? So let's say that you're going to buy that and you need to buy all these parts. You need to get a monitor, you need to get a tower, you need to get a keyboard and a mouse and some speakers, and then you need programs, you need software. You might have to get Microsoft Office or whatever you need to do. Babies' brains are kind of the same thing. So I'm at the upper level, that's cerebral cortex. The lower levels are intact and working. The brainstem, as we'll get to eventually, is what keeps us alive. So obviously, that has to be functional. But when we talk about that upper level, the cerebral cortex, a baby has all those parts, all right? Neurons, we're going to talk about that in a second. All right, it has all these neurons there. But what isn't quite ready yet is it isn't quite online. It's almost like having the parts, but you need to now set it up, program it. And basically what we mean by that is the neurons that are there start to line up. They start to make connections and communicate with each other in certain patterns based on that baby's experience. All right, baby's brains start to program itself for learning whatever it is they need to learn. So a good example of that is language. All right, a baby's brain will start to program itself, make connections for that child to be able to produce the language that it is hearing. All right, so if you're in a household that is speaking English, that baby's brain will wire itself to be able to make English sounds. Sounds that we don't use in English, like trilling R's and things like that, will start to fade. That's why it is so much harder to learn later on. Right? Your brain becomes programmed for what it is that you're learning. And then one of the other words we sometimes use here is pruning. Certain neurons and dendrites start to become pruned, and the connections that are formed become stronger, which is why you become better at those things. This process of plasticity is the ability of a baby's brain, or actually even adults. We all have what we call plastic brains. That's the ability to learn from experience, to make new neural pathways in order to learn new skills. That ability is huge at the beginning. This is another way you can think of it is think about building a city. Okay, you go into a desert and you have to build a big city. You have everything there. You can just set it up the way you want. Not a big deal. But what if you went into a huge metropolis like New York City and had to reroute everything? It'd be very tough. The same kind of thing. Once that, at the beginning, when a baby's brain is very, very plastic, it picks up new skills really, really quickly. The brain is wiring itself. What happens, though, as we get older, those pathways get more connected, more rigid, and it's harder to reroute things. We can still do it, otherwise you wouldn't be listening to this and learning anything new. But it does become a little bit trickier as we get older to reroute the pathways. Just like reprogramming a computer is a little bit harder than starting from scratch. All right, so plasticity is a very important thing. All right, this is the ability of that brain to wire itself. How does it do that? We'll talk about neurons. All right, neurons are the building block here of our nervous system. These are what makes those connections, that makes us think and feel and act in whatever we're doing. So it's important to kind of understand what we mean by neurons and what the parts are. So this is my little neuron guy. Obviously, real ones don't have eyes, but we want to make this fun. So anyway, this is a good example. We have nerve cells all through our body. They all have the basic same parts, but they're kind of set up a little differently. All right, nerve cells in the brain, the neurons, look more or less like this. All right, and of course they're very, 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 very tiny. All right, so neurons have some basic parts to them. Part of it is, first of all, they have a cell body. They're cells. They have a cell body with a nucleus instead of eyes. All right, that's what most cells have. All right. Neurons then have these spindly things that come out from the one end called dendrites. Those are the receptor part of the neuron. These are the parts that get in the information. Now, in the brain, that's from other neurons. It's taking in information from other neurons. In other nerve cells, like in my hand, you're getting information from the outside world. So this is the receptor part of the cell. So messages come in from the dendrites, go through the cell body, and then get sent down through the axon. The axon is sort of like a cord. It's like if you think of analogies again, like an electrical cord, all right, that comes down from the cell body. And the message travels along this. This message is sort of like an electrical current. It goes right through there. And then that neuron will send the message to the next one. It's all or nothing. It's what we call an action potential. If this neuron gets enough message, it will send it. All right, it doesn't halfway send it. All right, it either does or it doesn't. Okay? How we get intensity of responses is by how fast those messages are going and also by how many neurons are being activated. All right. So one thing about the axon, all right, one of the other things that happens as a child's nervous system is maturing, an interesting fun fact, we used to think that babies' brains were completely online and all pretty much developed by around age 7. Today, we know that's not true. It's into the 20s till a brain is really fully online in that respect, in terms of the cerebral cortex being able to take over. But besides all the neural connections, and another thing that's happening as that baby's brain is maturing is a process called myelination. Myelin is a protein that is set along the axon. It helps the messages to go quicker. It's like an electrical cord. If I have my lights here, all right, and you can see the impulses going along here, lighting up all of these different lights. If I kink my cord here or somehow break it or tie it or start to cut parts, well, I wouldn't do that while it's on, but if I did that, what would happen to the impulse? It wouldn't go through as nicely, it wouldn't go through as smoothly, it might even become interrupted. All right. Myelin is a protective, it's like this insulation that gets put down there to allow the message to go through more quickly and uninterrupted. This is a process that happens. It makes this much more efficient. All right. This goes on in the first few years. A disorder that most of you have heard of, multiple sclerosis, is the reversal of this. That this multiple sclerosis, I can talk, I think, is a autoimmune disorder, and what happens is the body starts to attack the myelin sheath, the myelin insulation, and break it down, and then that interrupts how messages can go through here. All right, but in infancy and early childhood, it's put down, allowing babies to become more deliberate, better at doing things, thinking, actions, everything. It just becomes smoother because of this process. All right, so now you have a message. It's going through this all the way here, and now it has to send the message to the next neuron. All right, neurons do not touch directly. I know in some of the pictures in the PowerPoint, they look like it because they get very, very close, but they don't. There is a gap, a little space between them. This is what's called the synapse. All right, at this point, in order to get the message across that gap, the electrical message has to be transferred to little chemicals, which are then sent out from the axon of one and picked up by the dendrites of the next one. These little chemicals that cross the synapse are called neurotransmitters. These are very, very important. There's lots of neurotransmitters. There's several. They're in your book. You can look at them. But the ones that are most we think about and talk about the most in psychology are 3. One of them is serotonin. Serotonin is the one that we are altering in a lot of people with anxiety, depression, and a lot of the mood disorders. All right, serotonin is again, makes sense. It affects mood. All right, and so when we talk about drugs like SSRIs, what they are doing is allowing more serotonin to be available in the synapses, theoretically improving mood. Another one is norepinephrine. This is another one that has a role in mood, especially in helping with anxiety, depression, again, those mood disorders. So this is involved in some of the antidepressants, SNRIs, like drugs. And then The other one that is implicated in a lot of psychological issues is dopamine. All right, this is the one that is implicated in schizophrenia and many of the medications for people with some of the more psychotic based disorders are given drugs that affect dopamine. All right. Now today there are also mix and match. It's not as cut and dried as that. Sometimes some of the drugs that influence dopamine will help people with depression, and sometimes drugs that affect serotonin can help other disorders as well. But those are the three that you will hear a lot about in this particular class. All right. So that's how a neuron works. There's that. One other little fun fact I just wanted to say. One of the ways that we can study how the neurons are functioning and messages there is something called an EEG. An EEG is an electroencephalogram, and what they do is put these electrodes on your head. It doesn't hurt, other than the fact that you kind of have this glue in there. But what it does is it measures the brain activity. All right. Interestingly, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that lime jello, if you try to do an EEG with one of them, actually does have some brain activity, or like brain activity, similar to what a person might, well, I'm not saying a very intelligent person, but some kind of brainwaves. And what does that mean? Does that mean that lime jello is a real brain, and so if we eat it, we're like zombies and eating brains? Or does it mean that the fact that EEGs are not as sensitive, or maybe more sensitive than we'd like them to be? One of the reasons they use EEGs is not only to look at people that have disorders, but sometimes to make decisions about people, whether they are brain dead. And maybe it's not the best, because sometimes things are showing activity that really aren't alive. All right, so that's a fun fact for today. So study your brain, learn some brain parts, and just for the last part of this, guess what? A brain part. You'll remember a hippo on campus. So hippocampus, memory. Thank you very much.